in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. This is Buck Joffrey. This is part 2 in our question and answer session with Phil Ferragamo.
Okay, next question.
Yeah.
This is from Lisa. Can you really absorb 1 gram of protein per pound per day? Yeah, because it's quite a lot of protein.
That is a lot of protein. Yeah, it is. Okay, so where does this question come from in the first place? The question it relates to, Lisa, I think we've talked about it on this show. A lot of others who are in the fitness space, Blaine Norton, Peter Attia talks about this, but a lot of people, smart people, recommend this huge amount of protein if you're working out, right? And that amount of protein is 1 gram per pound of your weight. In other words, I right now am about 215 pounds. That the recommendation for me as somebody who actively works out from some of these people like Lane, like Peter, is to take in 1 gram. So I would be taking 215 grams of protein per day. So that's basically 2 huge ribeye steaks. Right? That's about where that comes out, I believe, because I think each one is like 100 grams of protein. Anyway, It's a huge amount of protein.
Okay? Yeah, it's a huge amount of protein.
It's a huge amount of protein, and I will say that it's like a real challenge to take in that kind of protein. The question is a really good one, okay? Like, what's the point of taking in that much protein? What is the point? There's a bunch of research on this about muscle growth rates. A well-trained individual might be able to gain 0.25 to 0.5 pounds. So that's like somewhere between 110 to 120 grams of muscle per week under the most optimal conditions. Okay? I mean, that's still a lot. Imagine putting on a half pound of muscle per week. I mean, that's a lot, right? But even if you do that, if you put on a half pound of muscle per week, that only translates to about 32 grams of muscle per day. What are you doing with all the extra protein is the question, right? So the answer is yes, you can absolutely absorb that amount of protein, but you're not going to use all of that protein to build muscle. You're just not going to.
Okay. What about like bone density and those kind of things then?
Yeah, those things. Yeah, I mean they're different variables. I mean, certainly not. They're not really related to like these extreme high levels of protein. I think the point is though, like, so then the question is like, why? Basically, what's the reason for recommending that much protein? It's not like guys like Lane or Peter, it's not like they don't know that there's a limit of how much that you can use. Answers to that seem to be, and I've kind of looked into this, and first of all, you can absorb a lot of protein, right? You may not use it all for muscle, but you can absorb a lot, and you're going to use it for a lot of other functions. But so that's one thing. So it's not just muscle, it's other things too, right? You can use the proteins for, creating your own enzymes and things like that. But I think what they're focusing on is the idea that taking in a lot of protein has one other effect, and that is actually to trigger anabolism. Anabolism meaning the growth of muscles, like from anabolic steroid, that word comes from, anabolism. So in other words, it's not necessarily that you're going to use all this protein to build muscle, but there is triggers in taking in that much protein to actually triggers muscle growth if you're taking in a lot of protein. Does that make sense?
Well, sounds like it's just easier to take steroid than
it might, but then you'd still need some protein there to build the muscles. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it would actually be a lot easier to take steroids if you're building muscle For sure. I think it would. A quick little shot instead of, man, I'm drinking these shakes all day. And it's just like, man, because I'm doing this stuff right now. Okay. Now, the bigger question in my mind, though, Phil, is that, and this is where I think the real challenging question comes, right? Is what is the effect of all this protein? Is it really a good thing to take in all this much protein? And that's the question I don't know the answer to, and I don't really believe that anybody knows the answer to, because I have there's some very, very smart people on both ends of the aisle who literally are saying the opposite thing. They've got the one side I've just talked about, like the guys like Peter Attia, you've got Lane Norton, all sorts of other fitness types who are talking about sarcopenia, and they're concerned about lean muscle mass because lean muscle mass is one of the biggest predictors of longevity. Right. So that's their argument for high protein and longevity. But on the other side of the aisle, we've had guys on our show like Walter Longo. Right. There's also, everybody knows David Sinclair, the geneticist from Harvard. They all will tell you that they are believers that a relatively low protein diet is really probably the key to longevity. Okay. Now their argument is that there's like a pathway that is considered one of the major pathways of longevity. And it involves a protein called mTOR. Now think of mTOR as a switch. Okay. When you switch mTOR on, it builds stuff. It builds muscle, all that kind of stuff. When you turn it off, it does the opposite. It sort of like cleans up messy stuff and eats away, zombie cells and things like that. Now, across species, what Sinclair and Longo are tell you about is that if mTOR is turned off, these animals or worms or whatever, they live longer, right? So more protein, more mTOR on would therefore mean a decrease in longevity, in theory. So that's what the other side of this whole coin is. Did any of that make sense to you or no?
Yeah.
It did. So you've got them saying, well, look at the chemical pathways. You're going to increase mTOR and you're not going to live as long. And they're saying if you look across species, that's the truth. And if you look if you look across epidemiology and you look at like these Peruvian pygmies and stuff like that who don't make much growth hormone, and therefore, they have less what's called insulin-like growth factor 1. I know I'm getting totally out there, but the point is that these people live longer, and the idea is that they probably don't stimulate mTOR as much. And that's the one side. Peter and Lane and those on the other side will say, well, it's pretty simple. If you don't have lean muscle mass in your 60s and 70s, then you're going to die earlier. You see that these are literally polar opposite views on this. So what I would say...
So you should just do whatever you want anyways then.
Here's what I think, though. I mean, first of all, so I am like super high protein, but it's honestly, it's really not a longevity push for me. It's a vanity push because I'm like trying to get ripped, right? I'm trying to get jacked. So the smart thing probably to do based on these kinds of opinions, honestly, is to be moderate. If I wasn't trying to build a bunch of muscle, I would probably be like, okay, well, I'll just kind of do my thing and make sure I try to get maybe at least, 0.6 grams per pound just to make sure I'm getting enough protein, but not overdoing it. That's what I would do if it was a pure longevity play. That's what I would do. But because I'm trying to because I'm trying to get jacked, I'm doing the 1 gram per pound right now.
Oh, are you actually counting your calories and proteins per day?
I count my protein. It's too hard for me to count calories. I don't really understand how to do it because it's like you eat something. Right. How do I know how many calories are in that? I have no idea. I know you can get calorie counters and stuff like that, but it's like, I mean, I don't know. I just mostly count protein. That's what I do.
Gotcha.
Yeah. By the way, like if you want to build muscle, you have to have a positive caloric intake. There's a guy, I forget his name, last name Schoenfield, who's a PhD, who's like sort of the guru on muscle hypertrophy. And he says that if you really want to grow muscle, you got to have probably at least a 500 calorie surplus every day. So in the short term, what that would do is it would actually, it would probably make you just a little bit soft too. You'd grow muscle, but then you would also get maybe a little bit pudgy. And then the idea would be that after a period of time, you just cut a little bit, cut the calories, and your muscles would kind of get, show better because you're losing a little bit of fat.
You don't lose muscle first when you do the cut? Not
if you're taking in a bunch of protein. So that's another area where a high protein diet comes in. So if you're cutting and you're doing a gram per pound of protein, you will maintain vast majority of that muscle, and you'll just burn fat.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the whole concept behind a lot of this. Behind a lot of these people who go through these big builds and then they have their cut phase. That's the whole concept. A lot of people listening probably going, "Yeah, of course, you idiot." But I'm relatively new to this weightlifting, bodybuilding space, so it's new to me.
I don't know if you know this, the producer and actor of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's a sitcom, and every season he will show up really chubby, and then next season really cut, and then another season really chubby.
Oh, really?
Cut.
That's probably what it was.
Yeah.
It was probably like trying to build muscle and then get cut. But you'd think he would have timed it with this show, right? So that he was getting pudgy when the show wasn't on, and then he would get cut on the show. Right. That's what I would do.
Yeah, he's also just doing it for fun too, to show people oh, look how fat I am right now, and then next season I'm completely ripped. So
that's hilarious.
Yeah, if you're listening out there, go check that out. It's pretty funny. Okay, next question. So I kind of want to know for myself. I snore, as I mentioned in the previous podcast episodes. Now everybody says you should sleep on your side. If you sleep on your side, you will stop snoring. Your airwave will be much clearer. Is there any truth to that?
Yes. And here's why. So when you are, let's distinguish between, let's talk about snoring and sleep apnea, because these are very important topics. What is snoring? Snoring is just noise. When you're sleeping, you use a little bit, you lose a little bit of muscle tone in the back of your throat and your soft palate and the base of your tongue and all that. And snoring is just vibration noises that are coming from air coming in and out and sort of vibrating against the soft tissue that doesn't have tone. So normally if it had tone, it would just be stiff, right? So it wouldn't vibrate and wouldn't make any noise. And because it doesn't really have much tone, you're getting this noise. So that it's a pain in the ass for people who are sleeping by you if that happens, but it is not harmful per se. Let me just also get into sleep apnea, and then we'll talk about positional issues. But sleep apnea is the more dangerous thing, and pretty much anybody who has sleep apnea snores. So if you are a snorer, you should absolutely be screened for sleep apnea. There's no doubt about that. You can get these home tests. They're pretty easy to do. And the reason is that if you have sleep apnea, it is an independent risk for cardiovascular death. It's a big deal. And high blood pressure is probably, I'm guessing, I have a hunch that most diagnoses of what are called idiopathic hypertension or high blood pressure without a known cause are probably related to sleep apnea. I believe that to be the case. I don't know that I've ever seen any studies but I think that it's probably true. So what sleep apnea is is a little different from snoring, because before I talked about loss of tone and vibrating of tissue. Sleep apnea is the next level, where you lose sort of that tone, and the tissue, as air comes in, collapses in on itself. Now, let's talk about the positional situation. When you are on your back, Phil, your tongue falls back, into your airway, right? Can you picture that? Sort of the back of your tongue, because your tongue is like going all the way back in your throat. So if you can imagine, your tongue is kind of falling back, and all of that tissue kind of collapses into that's into one space. And when air comes into that, what happens is now you don't just have soft tissue vibration, you have collapsing and an inability of air to actually make it through. You literally you're not breathing, right? It stops your airway. It stops breathing. And so when that happens, after a few seconds, your body will wake you up if your oxygen levels are going down, and it'll wake you up suddenly. And people with sleep apnea usually wake up sort of like gasping for air. That's the classic thing. They gasp for air. And, it feels like you're dying or something like that. I know that because I have a little bit of sleep apnea myself. If you change the position of sleeping, you can mitigate how much you snore and how much sleep apnea you have. I mean, in fact, so sleeping on your side, absolutely. Now, if you can imagine, before everything, when you were on your back, everything was pushing to the back of your throat. Now you're on your side. All those tissues are moving to the side. They're not all sort of collapsing in onto your airway, right? I was saying, this is not just a theoretical thing. This is a real thing. In fact, in my case, so I had a sleep study done because, I do have a tendency sometimes to snore. What they found on the sleep study was interesting because, so I had an apnea-hypopnea index of 9. What that means is that every hour I was having like 9 episodes of apneas, which is like stopping breathing, or hypopneas, which is like a restricted breathing. 9 per hour sounds like a lot, right? But that's actually mild. That's mild sleep apnea. Yeah. There's people who have like 50, 60, 80, 120. Imagine all night long, basically having 120 times per hour where you're like, you stop breathing. How can that be healthy? It's horrendous, and, cause high blood pressure, and, your sleep, and probably it's going to increase your risk of dementia, any number of things. Okay. So in my case, my apnea-hypopnea index was 9. And the reason why I never really did much about it is because specifically, I pretty much didn't have any apnea episodes if I was not on my back. If I was on my back, that's where all of the apnea-hypopnea happened. So for me, it was very much positional. Just don't sleep on your back is the moral of the story in my case. And if I don't do that, I'm generally I'm not in danger of having significant events. But I do encourage people you should too, Phil. If you snore a lot, you probably should get tested just to make sure you don't have like severe sleep apnea, or anything that really needs to be treated. And, like, what do you do if you have sleep apnea? Then there's obviously you can get the CPAP machines, which are like these great big machines that you put in a mask on and stuff. It's a big deal, and a lot of people don't want to do it, and there's compliance issues and all that kind of things. People don't end up doing it. But there's also a lot of other things. There's dental appliances that you can use that'll just kind of pull your jaw forward a little bit. There's things like that. So bottom line is, I think it's worth knowing. Yeah, it's interesting, actually. That's a very good thing to bring up. Mouth taping actually seems to help people. I don't have any data on this, and it probably is some, but anecdotally, mouth taping does seem to help because it seems to forces you to breathe through your nose, and air coming through there. I think I don't know. I'm guessing it probably has to do with the fact that, you don't have air pulling down and involving your soft palate anymore. And you certainly are less likely to snore in that case, right? Because you're not going to go through the mouth and have the soft palate involved. But I have heard that people have had significant benefit with sleep apnea with mouth taping as well. So that's probably worth a try too for you. So.
Yeah, I'm just worried I'm gonna die. I think that's a valid concern.
Yeah, if you listen to this,
because a lot of people have. Sorry, a lot of people have sinus issues, right?
Yeah.
What if you have you tape your mouth and then you have a sinus episode? Are you just gonna die?
It's funny you say that because I've actually if I've taped my mouth a few times, I have just to see if it would work, and I don't know. For me, it didn't seem to do that much. A lot of people say it does, but when I did do that, I also put on one of those, those breathe right things to open your nose up.
Oh.
So
I thought you were gonna say one of those clamps that close your nose.
No.
Not breathing at all.
It's basically just like committing suicide, like asphyxiation. You've just like completely made it so that you can't breathe. No, but the breathe right thing certainly helps me to do that. I mean, if I do it, but I don't know. It doesn't really seem to help me that much. So I wasn't like, I wasn't going to do it, but I think it's probably if somebody's going to tape their mouth and they have problems with allergies and sinuses and all that, it might be worth doing a little bit of that as well. So.
Cool. Do you do anything for blue lights, computer blue lights? Because I stare at a monitor all day and I just feel like, is it going to damage my eyes a lot, or what do you do? The thing with blue lights, I think the biggest issue with blue light has to do with, at least what I think about blue light for is its effects on sleep. So, I think the biggest issue is just making sure that you limit the amount of blue light that's, that you've got going 2-3 hours before bed. I think that's the biggest issue. Blue light is a natural thing, right? It's like during the day, there's blue light out there. So blue light is not a bad thing. It actually makes your brain aware that you are awake. The problem is when it's like nighttime outside and you still got blue light blaring through your eyes, it confuses your brain. And that's where the problem is. Oh, it doesn't damage your eyesight or anything like that?
No, it doesn't damage your eyesight. You certainly can get some fatigue, but it doesn't damage your eyesight. No. Okay, what else you got, Phil?
Okay. All right, last question. This is from Teresa. Buck, I was listening to a podcast with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he said he had worm in his brain. Do you know anything about that? Is that why he's so weird? That's
a two-part question, and I think it's so yeah, it's interesting. I had heard about this too. Initially, this was like people thought he was just being slandered, that like he had a worm in his brain, right? It was like kind of an insult or something that he had a worm in his brain. As it turns out, so he used to travel quite a bit in South America, apparently, and there in parts of South America there are these tapeworms. Parasitic infection with something called cysticercosis. So his story was basically, apparently he had this growth looking thing, and I think it was on his frontal lobe, and everybody thought he had a brain tumor, and he had his uncle Teddy also had a brain tumor, so he was all like teed up and ready to go apparently for brain surgery. He was getting a consultation. Everybody thought this is definitely a tumor. But as it turns out, he ended up he didn't have surgery. Somebody gave him the correct diagnosis, which was unusual. It was neurocysticercosis. In other words, he had a worm in his brain. Yeah. And it's actually the most common parasitic disease of the nervous system. And in other countries, like sometimes people find out about it because they'll start having epileptic symptoms. They'll start having seizures and so on and so forth. You can get it through contaminated food and water. So it's like you're wondering, how do you get a worm in your brain? It's like, basically you might have some contamination, and the next thing you know, the egg of some parasitic worm ends up, planting itself in your brain. And obviously this can be lethal. If you find out about it, you can treat it with antiparasitic drugs. But again, it's, Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia. Some of the things that are higher risk, beyond just the water is, again, it's one of these things that tends to be more common as in pork. So proper cooking of pork. That seems like, pork has a few of those kind of issues. And maybe that's why in the Old Testament, that's why they didn't want people eating pork. But there is some worm issues there. So to the extent that he had neurocysticercosis, he had it, but apparently they've basically been following this thing with images, and it's not changing. So the assumption is that the thing is dead, that it's just like a dead worm in his brain. So that's a true story. He does have. So this is a presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So the question is, the second part of the question is it why he's so weird? Now, I'm not going to comment on the weird part. He's certainly a different sort of guy compared to the other Kennedys, for sure. And, he is known for, having some different points of view. Could that be affecting him? Absolutely, it could. But, the question, because of the location of this thing, I believe it was in his frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is ultimately like sort of, it's makes you who you are. So if you have any sort of mass, you have anything there, it can absolutely affect your brain. I guess the question is, and I don't know the answer to this, is was he any different before he had neurocysticercosis than after? And I don't know the answer to that. But yeah, it's an interesting an interesting thing, right? I'm sure it'll come up too. I'm sure it'll come up in these, as the election kind of gets closer, because people will want to slander him and talk about how he's got a worm in his brain and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's probably making any difference. But yeah,
people are probably saying it's like a Ratatouille situation where the worm is like controlling his limbs.
A Ratatouille situation? Explain that. What is that?
You don't know the Ratatouille movie, the Disney movie? Ratatouille?
I don't think I watched it. I know it was out, and I know my kids watched it.
Yeah, it's a rat holding a guy's hair to control his limbs to move and cook and stuff.
Ooh. Got it. So you believe that the worm might be in control of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, exactly. The worm is saying, how to dominate the world.
Ratatouille situation. I love that. Dude, you should start spreading that on the internet. It's RFK Jr. is controlled by a worm in his brain.
Yeah. The world is flat.
Through the eyes of a tapeworm.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's probably good. As we probably talked a fair amount for this week. By the way, if you are interested in asking some questions and getting them answered on the show, Phil, how do they do that?
Well, they can reach out to buck@sapiopodcast.com, or, if you're watching this on YouTube, comment down below your questions. We'll get to them for sure.
Fantastic. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.